This is Ken Pyle, and we're here at the Metaswitch 2014 Forum. We're Theme Bubbly of Disruptive Analysis, and one of the things that seems like it's going to be very disruptive is WebRTC. You just spoke about that. Why don't you give us a brief overview of what it is, and we'll launch into some questions.
Sure. WebRTC is a new form of web and mobile application interface which allows people to create all sorts of innovative voice and video applications real-time in either the browser or into mobile apps. And if you like, it's almost like creating Skype in the browser is the easy way of thinking about it for sort of voice or video. It could be calling, conferencing, or really innovative things, anything from mobile karaoke to games to embedding voice into business processes or contact centers.
And it's interesting because you mentioned one that was announced recently, the whole Amazon. Part of that is using this service, right?
Certainly. Amazon has a thing called Mayday, which is like a help function on its Kindle Fire tablets. And that actually has a one-way video and two-way audio, if you like, live assistant who's able to screen share and write on your Kindle screen to help you access features if you're confused about something. And that's apparently using some fairly standard contact center technology for the voice part, but some people have worked out that they're using something which is WebRTC or very, very close to it to do the video and screen sharing overlay on top of it.
Well, and it's interesting because, and you mentioned this later in your presentation today, that when you gave the whole idea of conference, these web conference things. One of the things that's really frustrating to me is I have to download a plugin every time. It takes 10 minutes to set it up. And
I get the same thing. I mean, the number of being an analyst, I get a lot of conference calls with, as you probably do, with journalists of various vendors, operators, and the number of times when I've had to suffer from. Well, it's the plugin and downloading it. It's partly because a lot of times if they do have audio in the plugin, it uses Flash or something quite old and clunky, and it's a real pain. Now, WebRTC will help that, particularly at the moment. If you have Chrome or Firefox, it does WebRTC straight out the box. They are WebRTC enabled already. There's open questions about when Microsoft and Apple will support it. Apple is anyone's guess, and how and when, hopefully maybe sometime in the next year, we're not sure. Microsoft has indicated support for a version of WebRTC called ORTC, which might end up being WebRTC 2.0 in a year or two's time. But in the meantime, ironically, there is now for some use cases, there are some plugins available for IE and Safari if you really want to use a particular application. Indeed, one of them has recently been open source. So it doesn't get around the no plugin rule, but at least it means that if someone creates a cool WebRTC application, it's at least in theory going to be available to everyone.
And one of the things I think it's important to kind of go back to what you do, and that is, you look at new technologies, and this one you called disruptive, right?
My company name is Disruptive Analysis, but I'd say probably 70%, 80% of the time, I end up being disruptive by looking at things and saying what won't work.
Yeah.
I'm often an anti-forecaster of saying, well, that's not going to happen, that's not going to happen, that sounds really good on paper but has 10 practical problems. Conversely, WebRTC is one of those areas where I'm more enthusiastic than the market is. I don't see any sort of particular fatal pitfalls, and I think part of that is it's usable in so many different use cases, whether it's in service provider context, enterprise, consumer web, mobile applications, even sort of data applications and machine to machine. And so frankly, even if one bit of that doesn't go quite as to plan, the others are already being commercialized and are likely to take up the slack. I think from a service provider point of view, again, there's probably about half a dozen different potential use cases within service providers for this technology. Either adding on web connectivity for their existing voice or video services, maybe something that's oriented more around the enterprise market for contact centers or unified comms or conferencing. But there are also some service providers are developing their own developer platforms around WebRTC. Telefonica has a company called TalkBox. NTT in Japan has one called Skyway, where they are looking to monetize the ability to act as a sort of video and voice enabler, perhaps allowing conferencing to be built into websites. or other use cases which are involving extension of WebRTC out to mobile apps, with essentially encapsulating the WebRTC technology in a form that's accessible to a normal mobile app developer rather than a telecom specialist.
And from a telecom perspective, it sounds like there's also, Metaswitch, one of the things they were talking about here about having that gateway capability so you get to the PSTN, right?
Yeah, and certainly there are a number of uses for WebRTC gateways I'm seeing. For a service provider, it could well be, again, related to enterprise and contact centers, or providing where an enterprise has a hosted voice proposition to extend that out to web-based, if like web phones rather than soft phones. Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of work looking at sort of integrating WebRTC into IMS and various other NGN platforms. That's taking a little longer to come to fruition because it has to go through the usual sort of extensive testing and validation and legal and regulatory cycles. But I would expect there to be trials maybe later this year, or sort of early launches next year on that type of thing.
And just leave it on one last note, that you've said in your research and your analysis you've gotten some interesting use cases, from speaker makers to...
I think one of the things I find fascinating is the number of things which come out the woodwork. So, there's a company that makes, it looks like an iPad, bolted to a Segway. Yeah. It's called Double Robotics, which has it's almost like a telepresence robot where you can imagine someone's real-sized face as a video at head height, and this thing trundles around the office. So you can do management rather than work from home. You can manage from home.
And managed by rolling around.
Right, yeah, exactly. It's managed by rolling around, like peer over your employees' shoulders, the robot. But there's also talking to consumer electronics companies who are looking at this. Maybe find it in future embedded versions of hi-fi for audio distribution. I can certainly imagine for some parts of the world a karaoke application, distributed karaoke. Who knows, even maybe music jamming. Google's Chromecast dongle, which sends video from your PC to a TV, that uses part of the WebRTC spec for data communications internal to that. It basically links sort of two browsers together. Okay. So there's all sorts of interesting things that are going to crop up around the data side as well.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned the development part of it, right? It takes very little. Right?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about this is that there's now sufficient number of toolkits, both the official APIs and third-party platforms, bits of open source, relative ease of development, that one of the attractions of WebRTC for creating voice and video innovations and applications is it makes it cheaper and easier to experiment. Mm-hmm. So pretty much anyone can play around with this, and it's sort of it might not be on day one fully carrier grade, but it may be applications where that doesn't matter. So there was a service provider in Europe, Telenor, Norwegian telco, developed a web-based, essentially Skype in the browser, called a service called Appear-In, and apparently they developed that with 3 interns over the summer last year, and since then they've polished it and they've upgraded it. But it's having a small team for a small number of months, rather than a large team for a year.
So you can fast fail. Well, Dean, I really appreciate your time here.
Cheers.
Insight. Thanks.
Thank you.